The price of a woman in the mud-choked yards of Dunmore Station was $12 and a bottle of rye. Tess found that out the hard way. She hadn't meant to be there at all. She'd come down from the Athabasca country with her uncle's pack horse and a letter of introduction to a grain merchant on the south side of town, a man named Elroy Finch, who was supposed to give her work for the winter. Clerk work, filing, accounting, the kind of quiet indoor labor that didn't ask much of a woman except her handwriting and her discretion. But Elroy Finch had died in September, and nobody had thought to write and tell her that. So there she was, standing in the November cold, with a horse that wasn't hers. A letter, addressed to a dead man, and 40 cents in her coat pocket, which was not a coat so much as a wool blanket she'd pinned at the shoulders and belted with a piece of harness leather. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since morning. She could feel it in her teeth. She made 3 mistakes that afternoon. The first was selling the horse, because she needed to eat. The second was accepting a meal from a man called Rook Dunnigan, because she was hungry enough not to ask what he wanted in return. The third was trusting the woman at the boarding house on Mercy Street, who smiled too wide and locked the door behind her from the outside. By the time Tess understood what kind of place it was, she'd been there 4 days. She hadn't screamed. Screaming was the kind of thing that got you hurt faster, but she'd barely slept, and she hadn't eaten since the first night. And when they walked her out into the grey morning light and stood her up in front of a cluster of men in heavy coats, she felt something go very still inside her. Not fear, she was past fear by then, and something more like the sky before a big storm. Just quiet and flat and waiting. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the mountains to the west, blue and distant and cold, and she thought about the fact that her mother had always said the Rockies looked like they were painted on, like they weren't real. Her mother had been wrong about a lot of things, but she'd been right about that. They did look painted. They looked like something from a world that had nothing to do with mud and rope and the smell of unwashed wool and men laughing at something she couldn't hear. She heard a number. She heard another one, higher. Then she heard boots on frozen ground coming toward her, and she made herself look. He was not what she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Someone meaner, maybe, or older, or with the particular look of a man who enjoyed what he was doing. But he was just a man. Big, yes. The kind of it came from years of hard work, rather than anything given at birth, wide across the chest, with a beard that had gone a little ragged and hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than skin. He had a grey wool coat that had seen better decades, and a hat pulled low against the wind. He didn't look at her with hunger. He didn't look at her with pity either, which she appreciated more than she could say. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't decided how to solve yet. He handed the money to the man on her left, without looking at him. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than she expected, "You got anything with you?" "No," she said. He nodded once, turned and walked toward a horse tied at the fence. He didn't check to see if she was following. He seemed to assume she would, the way you assume a gate will swing if you push it hard enough. She followed. His name, she found out, was Cutter Hale. He said it, like it was information she might need for practical purposes, not like an introduction. He said it on the road out of town, about a mile in, when the silence had stretched long enough that she'd started to wonder if he was capable of speech at all. "Tess Mallory," she said. He nodded again. Kept riding. She was up behind him on the horse. Her own had gone to someone else's pocket. And she tried to hold herself far enough back that she wasn't touching him. It was hard. The horse moved, and she shifted, and the cold was getting into her through the blanket coat, and after a while she stopped trying and just held on to the back of his coat and stared at the road going by beneath them. "Where are we going?" she asked, when the town had been swallowed by the trees behind them. "Up," he said. She waited. He said nothing else. Up turned out to mean a long way. The road became a track. The track became something that was less a path than a set of suggestions, and by the time the cabin came into view through the spruce trees, the light had gone amber, and the cold had teeth. She could see her breath in solid clouds. She'd stopped being able to feel her left foot somewhere around the second hour. The cabin was not large. It was built low against the hillside, like it was trying to hide, with a sod roof that had gone white with frost, and a stack of cut wood against the east wall that was taller than she was. There was a lean-to on the north side with a pen that held 2 goats and a mule. There was a well with a wooden cover. There was a water barrel with ice along the edges. There was nothing soft about any of it. He got down from the horse and started untacking without looking at her. She slid down on her own, landed wrong on her numb foot, and had to catch herself on the fence rail. He glanced over once, looked away again. Inside was one room, a stove, a table, a shelf of tins and dried things, a sleeping area curtained off in the corner with a piece of canvas. He built up the fire without being asked. She stood near it and tried to feel her hands again. "You'll sleep there," he said, nodding toward a cot along the wall. It had a folded blanket on it and nothing else. "Where will you sleep?" He gestured toward the curtained corner. She waited for something more, some condition, some explanation of what this was, and what she owed him, and what he expected in return. He said, "You can cook?" "Yes." "Good." He pulled his coat off and hung it on the nail by the door. "Don't go through my things." That was apparently the sum of it. He was not easy to be around. She understood that quickly, not because he was cruel, but because he occupied space in a particular way, like a large rock in a stream, and everything had to move around him. He had a system for everything. The axe went in one place, the hatchet in another. The flour tin was always to be kept on the left, the salt on the right. The goats were fed at the same time morning and evening, and not a minute different, because they got anxious otherwise, and anxious goats gave less milk. She learned by watching. Mostly because he didn't explain things so much as do them, and she was expected to follow. She didn't ask why he'd bought her. She thought about it every night in the dark, listening to the wind come down off the mountain, listening to him turn over on his cot behind the canvas. She ran through the possibilities, the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth, tentatively, then firmly, then, all at once, protection for the winter. Company. Something worse that just hadn't shown itself yet. But he didn't come near her at night. He didn't watch her in the way she'd been watched by the men in Dunmore. When she caught him looking at her at all, it was usually because she'd done something wrong with the flour or the fire, and his expression was the exact same one he gave the mule when it went sideways on a narrow trail, not angry, just resigned. She found that strange, and then she found it restful. And then she stopped, waiting for the other boot to drop because she was too tired. And the winter was settling in hard, and there was too much work to leave room for dread. She learned to cook on a wood stove that ran hotter than any she'd used before. She learned to keep the fire fed through the night, so they didn't wake to ice on the water bucket. She learned the shape of the territory. The north fence, the south slope, the creek that ran under the ice, the place halfway up the hill, where the spruce trees thinned and you could see all the way to the valley below. She didn't know why she kept going to that spot, just that she did. He found her there one morning, about 3 weeks in. She heard him behind her and turned, and he was standing about 10 feet away with an axe over his shoulder, looking at the view the same way she was. "Good spot," he said. "Yes," she agreed. They stood there for a while in the cold, not talking, looking out at the white valley and the dark tree line and the blue-gray mountains beyond that. She'd stopped thinking of the mountains as painted. They looked real now. They looked like the realest thing she'd ever seen. He said, "Eventually. You from around here originally?" "North of Lac La Biche," she said. "My mother's family had land there. Had. She died. The land went." He absorbed this, said nothing, went back to cutting wood. She stood there a while longer, then went back down to start breakfast. The accident happened in January. She was going to say, she didn't see it coming, but the truth was, she'd half seen it coming for 2 weeks. The way he'd been favoring his right side when he walked, the particular set of his jaw when he thought she wasn't looking, the fact that he'd been cutting twice as much wood as usual, like he was trying to build up a reserve against something. He was hauling a log down the slope behind the cabin when the ice gave. She heard the sound before she registered what it was, a sharp crack, and then a much worse sound, which was not a sound. So much as an absence of sound, the sudden nothing that comes after something goes very wrong. She found him at the bottom of the slope. He'd stopped himself against a boulder, which was the only good thing, but his left leg was wrong in a way that made her stomach roll over and then settle down hard into something cold and practical. She'd seen broken bones before. She'd set one once on her uncle's hired man in the absence of anyone else to do it. "It's broken," she said. "I know," he said. His voice was flat, which told her how much pain he was in. "Can you move?" "If I have to, you have to." Getting him back to the cabin was the hardest physical thing she'd ever done. He was twice her weight, and he couldn't put any pressure on the leg, and the slope was iced and the light was already going. She got his arm over her shoulders, and they went 6 inches at a time, stopping when he needed to breathe, stopping when she did. She didn't say anything reassuring. She just kept moving. She set the leg by firelight. She had to use 2 straight pieces of wood from the stack, and every strip of cloth she could find that would serve as binding, and she had to do it while he was conscious and not screaming. He didn't scream. He just gripped the table edge until she could hear the wood creak, and when it was done, she was shaking so hard she had to sit down on the floor and put her head between her knees. "You've done that before," he said. "Once. Went well." She looked up at him. He kept the leg. Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile if his face had been practiced at those. "All right," he said. "Good enough." He was not a good patient. He was, if anything, worse than the goats when they went contrary, quieter about it, but no less stubborn, always trying to do things he shouldn't, always looking at the work, not getting done with the expression of a man, watching his life savings slide slowly into a river. She caught him trying to stand on the leg 4 days in, and she told him, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, that if he did that again, she would tie him to the cot. He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, and sat back down. She cooked. She fed the goats. She brought in wood and water. She mended the north fence, where something had gone at it in the night. She never found out what. But the prints in the snow were too big to be a coyote. She did the work of 2 people without being asked, because there was nobody else to do it, and because the alternative was watching it all fall apart, and she'd watched enough things fall apart to last her a lifetime. At night, after she'd banked the fire and he'd settled, she sometimes sat at the table with the lamp turned low and thought about leaving. Not seriously. She knew she couldn't, not in February, not without a horse, not without gear she didn't have. But she let herself think it, the way you let yourself think about summer in the middle of the worst cold. Just to have the idea of it. Just to know it was a choice she was making, staying, not a trap, not an obligation she'd stumbled into in the mud-choked yards of Dunmore Station. A choice. She thought about that a lot. He started talking more when he couldn't move. She didn't think he did it on purpose. It was more like the enforced stillness wore something down in him, the same way ice wears down stone, slowly and without any drama. He talked about the territory, about the years he'd spent in it, about his brother, who'd died of typhoid in the summer of '98, and who'd been the better trapper of the 2 of them by a wide margin, and who had also made better biscuits, a fact Cutter seemed to find genuinely grieving. She talked too, eventually. Not everything. Not the boarding house on Mercy Street, not the 4 days before Dunmore, not the particular sound of a door locked from the outside. But other things. Her mother, the land north of Lac La Biche, and how it had looked in the fall, the aspens going gold in long rows, the geese going south in their ragged formations. Her aunt's kitchen, which had smelled of cardamom and pine pitch, the letter she'd written to Elroy Finch that had gone unanswered for 2 months because the man was in the ground. Quietly, completely, without feeling the need to respond. But he was listening, she could tell. One afternoon in February, when the cold outside was the kind that burned your throat to breathe, he said, "Why'd you come to Dunmore at all? Long way." From the north. She thought about it. "I needed to be somewhere new," she said. "Somewhere no one knew my name." He considered this. "Did it work? Not in the way I planned." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and brief. It was the first time she'd heard anything close to it from him. She found, to her surprise, that she was smiling. The leg healed slowly, the way everything healed slowly in the cold. By March he was up with a stick, by the end of March without one, though he still moved with a particular carefulness she'd come to know. A measuring quality, like a man who'd been reminded that his body had limits and was still deciding how he felt about that. The snow started going in April. First the south-facing slope, where the light hit in the afternoon, then the creek, which went from silent to loud almost overnight. She woke one morning to the sound of running water, and lay there listening to it for a long time, because it sounded like something beginning. She'd stopped, counted the days, somewhere in February. She didn't know if that was a good thing or not. She started thinking about what she would do when the passes opened. She had nowhere particular to go, which was a kind of freedom and a kind of terror in equal parts. She could go south, to Calgary or Edmonton, try for work there. She could go back north, though there was nothing there for her anymore. She could. She stopped thinking about it and went to make breakfast. He noticed. She knew he noticed, because there was a quality to his noticing that she'd come to recognize over the months, a very slight shift in attention. Nothing you could name, but present. He didn't say anything until May, when the high snow was finally gone and the world outside had turned that particular brutal green that comes after a long winter, like the land was making a point. He came in from checking the north fence and set his hat on the table and looked at her for a moment without speaking. She was kneeling by the stove, feeding it the last of the morning wood, and she looked up at him. "You thinking about leaving?" he said. It wasn't a question. She sat back on her heels. "The passes are open," she said. "They are." She waited. He said, "You could stay?" "Why?" she said carefully. "Would I stay?" He picked up his hat again. He turned it in his hands. He was not a man who did things with his hands without reason, and the gesture was so unlike him's that she found herself watching it with attention. "Because you kept this place together," he said. "Through the winter. You paid for me," she said, "in Dunmore." "I know what I did. $12, she said, "and someone else's rye." Something in his face shifted. Not shame, exactly, but something close to it. "I didn't," he started. "I know," she said. And she did. She'd known for months what he had and hadn't intended. I'm not saying it to hurt you." She looked at her hands. They were rough from the winter work, red-knuckled, no longer the hands she'd had when she came. "I'm saying it because I need you to know, that I've always known what I am here, what this is." "What do you think it is?" he said. She looked up at him. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said all winter. "That's what I need to figure out." He nodded, set his hat back on the table. "Take the time you need," he said, and went back outside. She went up to the spot in the spruce trees the next morning. She stood there in the spring cold, with the valley spread out below her, all that green and white and grey, and she thought about $12 and the locked door on Mercy Street, and her mother's cardamom kitchen and Elroy Finch dead in his grave, and the sound of Cutter's voice, saying, "You could stay," in the particular way he had of saying things, which was like a man putting something down somewhere and not picking it up again, just leaving it there in case it was wanted. She thought about the leg she'd set by firelight, about the goats, about February, the long February, and the sound of the creek in April and the feel of the world turning. She thought about the fact that she'd had, for the past 2 months, a set of cutter's gear she'd quietly assembled: pack, knife, a portion of the dried meat, tucked under the cot. Ready. A way out if she needed it. She'd never used it. She stood in the spruce trees for a long time. The valley was doing what valleys do in May, filling up with light from the east, going golden at the edges. A pair of geese went over, calling back and forth. Then she went back down to the cabin. He was at the table, going over the trap line records. He kept meticulous records, which was the only fussy thing about him. He looked up when she came in, and he waited, with that quality of waiting he had, complete and without urgency. She took off her coat, hung it on the nail by the door. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She reached into her coat pocket and placed something on the table between them. He looked down at it. She watched him look. It was not $12. It was more than $12. She'd found part of the winter's trap line earnings in the tin on the shelf in February and had been setting her portion aside for months because she kept her own accounts, always had. The small pile of coins represented her share of what the winter had been worth. "That's mine," he said slowly, not angry. More like a man finding a note in a coat he hasn't worn in a season. "A settlement," she said, "between us." He looked at the coins for a long time, then he looked at her. "And after the settlement?" "After the settlement," she said, "I'm a free woman, no obligation on either side." He nodded once. "All right." She folded her hands on the table. Outside, the creek was running loud with snowmelt. A goat called from the lean-to, ready to be fed. "As a free woman," she said, "I'd like to ask you something." He waited. "The summer's coming," she said, "and probably another winter after it. This place is hard to run alone. You know that better than anyone now." She paused. "Do you want me to stay?" "Not because of the wind, not because of the winter, because you actually want me here." The cabin was very quiet. The fire ticked in the stove. Cutter looked at the coins on the table. He looked at her coat on the nail by the door, hanging next to his. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I want you here." She nodded. She got up and went to feed the goats. She didn't let him see her face until she had it settled back into something ordinary, but she held the warmth of that one word against her chest, the whole walk to the lean-to, like a coal carried against the cold. The snow was gone from the south slope. The creek was running free, and somewhere up in the spruce trees, a bird was singing a song she didn't know the name of, small and clear and persistent, the way living things are once the hard season finally breaks.